I am very excited today to be introducing Professor Stefan Pfeiffer, who is Professor of Ancient History at the Martin-Luther-University, Halle-Wittenberg, if I got that right. Um, he has amazing publications, in my biased, not so biased opinion, on everything from imperial cult, Greco-Roman Egypt and its multilingual text, papyri, inscriptions, Roman contact with the East, a lot of different and interesting things. And I think today we're going to hear about something which draws on his expertise on multilingual texts and multicultural life in Greco-Roman Egypt. For those of you who've been with us before, you'll know that the structure is usually that the speaker will speak for somewhere between 45 to 55 minutes, and then we'll have questions at the end. Do feel free to either raise your hand and unmute yourself at the end to ask your questions, and I'll call on people one by one. Or you can also just put your questions in the chat and I will read them out. Um, but yeah, I'm very excited to hear about Greek and Egyptian epigraphy in contact from Professor Pfeiffer whenever you're ready.
So I hope everybody can see my presentation. And first of all, I want to thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to give this talk. Um, anyone who has ever taken a journey along the Nile admires the great temples of Egypt. Alongside the pyramids and the tombs of the pharaohs, they count among the highlights of a Nile cruise and are widely regarded as epitomes of Egyptian culture and religion. Few modern tourists are likely to realize, however, that the great temples of Edfu, Komombo, or Philae all date from the period marking the end of ancient Egyptian culture, the Greco-Roman period. The era of the pyramids lies farther from the Greek-Roman world than the Greek-Roman world does from us today. The temples were erected by indigenous priests who, since the end of the 4th century BCE, first lived under Greek and then from the end of the 1st century BCE under foreign Roman rule. These priests, at least according to the pictures and inscriptions, did not really take notice of foreign domination as they decorated their temples with ancient religious texts, offering formulas, hymns, purity regulations, myth, and much else, written in hieroglyphic script. The contents of these texts rested on a tradition and knowledge already 3,000 years old at that time. Yet, only religious specialists were still able to read these hieroglyphic inscriptions. For the actual Egyptian script of literature and temple administration of the period was Demotic. Since Egypt was under foreign rule, however, the language and script of royal administration was Greek. All three of these languages appear together on the famous Rosetta Stone we see here, which at the same time represents a mirror of the multicultural society of Greek Egypt. In Egypt of this period, we thus encounter a migrant society in which perhaps 5 to 10% of immigrants dominated a far larger indigenous population with a level of civilization that in some respects was more sophisticated than the young civilization of the Greeks. The Greeks and later the Romans thus encountered in Egypt an epigraphic culture that was already 3,000 years old. Against this background, I would like to pursue the question of what epigraphy can tell us about contacts between these two groups of population. Scholarship, for example, points out, I quote, "The relatively few signs of osmosis between the inscriptions in Greek and those in the native tongue reveal the cultural distance between settler and indigenous populations. It was pointed out by Jean Bingen. The culture and writing in Egypt differed markedly from the culture of writing in the Greek world. The majority of Egyptian epigraphic texts, since they were written on temple walls, were religious in content. These texts were bound to the pharaoh and the Egyptian priesthood. In Greece and Rome, by contrast, alongside sacred inscription, there were above all inscriptions connected with democratic or oligarchic practice of rule. In the Greek world, too, there were temples bearing inscriptions, but these often merely named the dedicator of the sanctuary. At times, especially in Asia Minor, one even finds text unrelated to the temple itself, but rather to the city's external relations. Temple walls could be used for the publication of treaties. The media bearing the text likewise differ considerably. In Egypt, temple and tomb walls predominate. Alongside them appear statues and, as in the Greek-Roman world, stelae. Here we have the statues, and here the stelae. Yet these, with their round-topped lunette and the double-winged sun, looked markedly different from Greek and Roman stelae, we here see on the left. In Ptolemaic Egypt, one further notices the complete absence of an important Greek monumental genre. From the Nile Valley, I know only of one single Greek temple in archaeological record, a ruler cult temple of Ptolemy III at Hermopolis. From the stoa surrounding the temple, only a Doric architrave with a Greek dedicatory inscription has survived. The bulk of Greek and Latin inscriptions in Egypt are found not on Greek, however, but on characteristically Egyptian monuments. I just give as an example the well-known stela of Gaius Cornelius Gallus. By contrast, I know of only one single Greek stele in which an Egyptian text, specifically a short divine epithet, was once inscribed. Egyptians thus seem to have felt a little incentive, felt little incentive to inscribe Greek monuments, such as stelae, with their own texts, whether hieroglyphic or demotic, whereas Greek could quite naturally be written on Egyptian monuments. In order to clarify the relationship between Greek and Egyptian epigraphic culture, we must therefore examine zones of contact, focusing above all on Greek epigraphy. To illustrate this, I will focus on three important Greek text genres. First, dedicatory inscriptions, second, honorific decrees, and third, sepulchral inscriptions. Finally, I will address the only genuinely new Greek text genre known solely from Egypt, the so-called proskynemata. One of the most frequent text genres of the Hellenistic world is that of the dedicatory inscription. Using this genre as an example, two possible forms of interaction with Egyptian texts can be identified in Greco-Roman Egypt, depending on the place of inscription. First, the Greek dedication can stand alongside an Egyptian dedication text without formal reference but convey something similar. And second, the Greek text may additionally name a different dedicator than the Egyptian text. Let us start with the first possibility. The coexistence of Greek and Egyptian dedication texts is found especially in monumental epigraphy. Let us take a look at the famous Temple of Isis on the island of Philae in Upper Egypt. Its Greek dedicatory inscription is placed on the upper cavetto above the main entrance to the naos. This inscription could just as well stand on a Greek sanctuary as we have seen in the case of Hermopolis. It reads, King Ptolemy, son of Ptolemy and Arsinoe, the sibling gods, and Queen Berenike, sister and wife of King Ptolemy, and their young children, dedicated the temple of Isis and Harpocrates. The hieroglyphic inscription inside the sanctuary, by contrast, employ an Egyptian text genre for the same act of dedication, one that follows a millennia-old tradition. There it reads, I quote, "The king of Upper and Lower Egypt." Then comes the name of Ptolemy III, the son of Ra, lord of the crowns. Here is the personal name of Ptolemy. He made it as his monument for his mother. It is, of course, his mythological ancestress Isis who is meant by the king's mother. Greek and Egyptian dedicatory texts thus have almost no correlation to one another, apart from the fact that they identify the king as the founder of the temple. The difference between the two inscriptions are obvious. The earthly queen consort and co-dedicator is missing in the Egyptian text, as are the children. However, and this is almost more important, the second deity of the temple, Harpocrates, the son of Isis, is likewise absent. Even more striking, however, is the fact that the temple was in reality already built under Ptolemy II and not Ptolemy III, as it is stated in large hieroglyphic characters on the door jamb just below the Greek inscription. The author of the Greek inscription thus adopted an Egyptian tradition according to which even investments in decoration of an Egyptian temple entitled a pharaoh to appear as its founder. Please keep this picture now in mind, as we will come back to it at the end of my paper, where I will show you a very interesting Latin inscription here in the lower part of the door. Before I can present Egyptian and Greek dedicatory inscription found in on the same medium, yet naming different dedicators, I must first discuss a well-known epigraphic habit of Greek inscriptions in Egypt and situate it within its Egyptian context. This concerns the practice of private individuals, royal officials, or private or military corporations dedicating temples and other objects to gods, while commemorating the ruler through the Greek construction hyper plus genitive. This formula enjoyed particular popularity on Egyptian temples or parts of temples, which led some scholars to assume that it was adopted from Egyptian conventions, a view that is nevertheless not fitting. It was in fact a practice developed in Alexandria. Greek citizens were already using the formula under Ptolemy I in Alexandria. By means of this expression, they could, in a political correct way, express loyalty to the ruling house without at the same time rendering cult to the ruler. Thus, the formula also enabled Jews to honor the ruler without participating in the ruler cult by dedicating their synagogues to the well-being of the king. This is meant by hyper basileus. It is translated into for the well-being of the king. The Greek formula was especially useful here because, according to the pharaonic ideal, only the pharaoh had the right and the duty to found or finance temples. In reality, however, as the Greek inscriptions employing the hyper formula show, it was mostly private individuals, priests, associations, or royal officials who appeared as dedicators and wished to make their ergotism known. In order, nevertheless, to express a relationship to the ruler, the dedicators resorted to the hyper formula. This is illustrated by a temple dedication in the Fayum from the reign of Ptolemy III, which simultaneously introduces us to the multiculturalism of Egypt. I quote, "For the well-being of King Ptolemy and Queen Berenice," this is the Hyper formula, "his wife and sister and his children, to Eris dedicated the sanctuary and its appurtenances, Arene and Theoxena, daughters of Demetrius, Cyrenaeans, daughters of Tarsis, whose Egyptian names are Nefersuchos and Tawes. In this case, two women from Kyrene, the Greek polis, dedicated a temple to the Egyptian goddess Taweret to Eris on behalf of the royal couple. Irene and Theoxena came from a Cyrenian-Egyptian mixed marriage and therefore also bore Egyptian names. Since such Greek dedicatory inscriptions were frequently found on Egyptian stelae that depict the pharaoh before the gods in the lunette, the old traditional notion, according to which only the pharaoh founds temple or dedicates temples, was preserved for the non-literate observer. Egyptian gods even immersed into the Greek gymnasia of Egypt, as shown by two Egyptian round-topped stelae of former Ephebes, who donated parcels of land to the Egyptian crocodile god. It thus becomes clear that through the Hyper formula, the gap between the necessary cultic fiction that the pharaoh is founder of Egyptian temples and actual dedicatory action could be bridged. The foreignness inherent in the Hyper formula and its usefulness within the Egyptian context is in turn demonstrated in a dossier of Egyptian dedicatory stelae of Parthenios from the early imperial period. In the lunette of these stelae, beneath a winged sun disk with uraei, there is in each case a scene of offering showing a pharaoh, undoubtedly the reigning Roman emperor, performing ritual acts before Egyptian gods. Below this, there is in each case a dedicatory text in hieroglyphs and either Greek or Demotic. The hieroglyphic text of one of these stelae reads, I quote, "Long live Horus, strong arm, king of Upper and Lower Egypt, lord of the two lands, Tiberius, the emperor, son of Ra, lord of the crowns, Caesar Augustus. He made this his monument for his father Geb, prince of the gods, the great god who resides in Coptos, a great gate in the house, so that he may be endowed with life." This is the traditional Egyptian dedicatory formula presenting the pharaoh as the donor of the building belonging to the temple. Quite evidently, the lunette and the hieroglyphic text correspond. The pharaoh performs a ritual of a temple endowment to the god, and the inscription links this to the dedication of a part of the temple to the deity. The stele thus illustrates on a small scale exactly what is also known from numerous temple reliefs and texts. The pharaoh is responsible for offerings and temple construction. In reality, however, it was a member of the local elite who carried out the construction as indicated by the Greek text. It reads, I quote, "For the well-being, Hyper, of Tiberius Caesar Augustus, year 18, 11th of Epiph, to Kronos, the great god, donated by Parthenios, son of Parmin, overseer of Isis." It was therefore not Emperor Tiberius, but Parthenios, who was the actual donor of the construction. Tiberius, who would hardly have interpreted this as an usurpation of a pharaonic duty, since he had no particular interest in pharaonic theology or a temple somewhere in Egypt, was acknowledged too because Parthenius financed the structure for the well-being of Tiberius, demonstrating thus his loyalty. On a stele with an identical lunette and hieroglyphic text, the donation is rendered also in Demotic, revealing the challenges the donors faced in translating the Hyper formula into Demotic. It reads, before ihr Herr, Tiberius Claudius Caesar Augustus Germanicus Imperator, again before but with embach, the preposition, Geb, Prince of the Gods, the great God who grants life, for Parthenius, son of Parmen, his mother being Taphioi, the overseer of Isis for eternity, and so on. The deity here in the Greek dative receives, as usual in Egyptian text, the formula embach, before, which signals immediately to the reader that the god is the recipient of the gift. For the hyper, intended to indicate that the emperor is to be thought of as the deity's beneficiary, Parthenius uses the preposition ihr Herr, which normally means at the time of or before. This is a rather awkward, almost skewed translation of the hyper. The attribution of different donors to a temple or a temple section, as shown, arose from the theological necessity that the hieroglyphic sacred language demanded. The pharaoh had to be named even when another individual was the actual donor, because in Greek one wanted to display one's own prestige and ergotism. This could also be expressed in Demotic, the language of Egyptian temple administration. This difference between the sacred hieroglyphic script and the two scripts of administration and conversation, Greek and Demotic, extended beyond buildings and temples also to simpler stone offerings. Here we have a typical Egyptian offering table now in Berlin, which bears hieroglyphic, Demotic, and Greek dedicatory inscriptions. The hieroglyphic inscription, the most elaborate, reads, I quote, may all prosper for the Coptic Osiris, first of the gold house. May he be inundated 1,000,000 times with what is in him. The Pharaoh fills for you the eye of Horus with its wine, being pure. Reharte lets the Coptic Osiris, first of the gold house, drink from his water, his beer, and his wine. Life. And then, may the Coptic Osiris, first of the gold house, be inundated with white, shining, and sweet milk, which comes from the two breasts of Sechator, so that the god is satisfied, having caused that you be given cattle for you, and then something is missing, your cows for you with milk, life. This offering formula, possibly recited during the pouring of first water and then milk over the table, names the pharaoh as a ritualist, as required in a temple ritual. Of course, pharaoh is not the donor of the object. The hieroglyphic inscription is effective in itself, even if no ritual is performed at all. It happens because it is written down in sacred language. As other temple texts show, the do ut des principle is effective. Because the pharaoh performs the offerings, the god bring the Nile, guarantee the king a long reign, or provide other benefits. The inscription thus concerns not the personal welfare of the private donor, but the welfare of Egypt as a whole, which indirectly benefits the donor. The offering table now also has a Demotic and a Greek dedicatory inscription. In Demotic it reads, the Coptite Osiris, first of the gold house, gives life to Parmen, son of Zenosiris, together with his brothers, together with his followers, for eternity. In Greek, by contrast, it is rendered very simply to Sarapis, the great god, donated Paniskos, son of Serapion, year 1827 of Pachons. Several points are notable here. First, two apparently different donors, Paniskos in Greek and Parmin in Demotic, are named. However, the two were not two different persons, but one and the same man. The Egyptian Parmin translates he of Min, son of Zenosiris, which means man of Osiris, simply rendered his theophoric personal and father's names into Greek, using the Interpretatio Graeca of the Egyptian gods. Paniskos is the Greek rendering of Parmin, Serapion is the Greek for Zenosiris, and Osiris is nobody else than Sarapis. The Greek inscription thus constitutes a full translation, while only the Demotic expresses the desire that Osiris grant life to Paniskos and his followers, which means that the dedication is meant for his and his companions' benefit. All three texts therefore convey partially different information but agree on the recipient of the dedication, Osiris of Coptos. So, coming to the next text genre. There is no epigraphic text genre in Greek epigraphy that is more prominent than the decree of the Greek polis. However, in Ptolemaic times, Egyptian priests took over this practice and issued honorific decrees for the Ptolemaic dynasty. This is, as I would like to say, the Premier League of epigraphy in Egypt. The priests inscribed their honorific decrees in three scripts: Greek, the ancient hieroglyphic sacred language, and the contemporary Egyptian cursive Demotic. Since these priestly decrees are far more elaborate than all other highly formulaic epigraphic text genres, which did not require users to have deep knowledge of Greek, their study provides a clear view of how Egyptians dealt with a typically Greek formulary. Two forms of interference are observable. First, at the level of text genre, and second, at the level of language. Let us begin with the interference at the level of genre. The priestly decrees exhibit all the formulas of a Hellenistic honorific decree. First, the dating according to the king's regnal year and the eponymous priests, concluding with the term Psaephisma. Next comes a statement regarding the assembly of the decision-making body and ending with apan or similar. The motivation is introduced as customary with epeide or equivalent. The decree itself is introduced with the usual formula, I quote, "with good fortune be it resolved by the priests of the country." Finally, the publication provisions and a hortatory formula appear. However, for theological reasons, the priest chose to augment the Greek structure with a crucial addition. Between the motivation and the actual decree, each multilingual decree of the priest contains a phrase I call the Anthon formula. For example, in the decree of Canopus, it reads, "For this reason, the gods have given them their kingship in well-established form, and they will grant them all other good things for eternity." The phrase "for this reason," Anthon, though rare in Greek honorific decrees, but a divine reward immediately following the justification of the decree is, as far as I know, unknown in Hellenistic honorific decrees outside Egypt. Its presence in every Egyptian priestly decree indicates a deliberate adoption of the familiar decree formula by the priests. This had a dual purpose. On the one hand, it reflects Egyptian ritual practice. The king's deeds enumerated in the decrees, in the justification of the decrees, correspond precisely to what temple reliefs report he performs in rituals for the Egyptian gods, the care for temples and gods, the protection of Egypt, and so forth. According to the do ut des principle, the king receives in these temple reliefs always a counter gift, which could include eternal rule. Through a small modification of the decree formula, the priest thus incorporated a usual monumentalized ritual and textual scene into a new formulary. On the other hand, the D'Antone formula, which is a reciprocity formula, allowed the priests to make a decisive point. Through the decrees, they had declared the king a god of every Egyptian temple, a radical innovation in Egyptian cult practice, ultimately implementing the Greek ruler cult in the temples. The reciprocity formula signaled that this new Macedonian god, now worshipped in the temple, remained directly dependent on the Egyptian gods. Now we can turn to linguistic interferences. The decree of Canopus shows that in some passages only the Egyptian text allows to understand the full meaning of the Greek decree. For instance, the text notes that the daughter of Ptolemy III, Berenike, had died in the same month as the daughter of Helios, had formerly passed away, followed by the phrase, and then now I quote the Greek, hen, the daughter of Helios, hen ho pater strexas onomasen, hote men basileian, hote de horasin autu. A standard translation in Greek textbooks reads now for this, whom her father lovingly called sometimes his crown, the basileia, and sometimes his side, Horaces. If one now consults the Egyptian version, it becomes clear that the priest did not mean crown and side. Both are legal translations of the Greek text, but they can also translate it in another way. And if we now read the hieroglyphic text, we can see that the passage must be understood mythologically, equating Berenike with the goddess Hathor Tefnut. In Demotic, it is stated that Berenike died, I quote, in the month when the embalming of the daughter of Ra previously occurred, whom he named as his Uraeus and his eye. In this context, we now see Basileia, which we say translate as crown, refers to the Uraeus-shaped royal crown, not the kingdom, which was the translation of the German scholar. And Horaces is the eye, not the eyesight. The hieroglyphic text makes this even clearer. Basileia and Horaces express a so-called parallelismus membrorum, denoting the same thing. Basileia is the Uraeus on the king's head, Tefnut in her protective, fire-breathing cobra aspect, and the crown on the crown, and Horaces is the eye of Ra, essentially the name of Tefnut. Here, the Greek text is clearly a translation of Egyptian mythological concepts. So now let us take a look at the funerary inscriptions. These were among the most widespread text genres in both Greek and Egyptian culture. In general, as with temple texts, interactions between Greek and Egyptian inscriptions are rarely observable. This separation between both cultures, which by no means implies any ethnic division, could result in a single individual receiving not one but two tomb stelae. One Egyptian and one Greek, as in the case of the Egyptian Parshi, also known as Apollonius. His family belonged to the local elite of Edfu in the 2nd century BCE. Exceptions of this cultural separation in funerary thinking can, however, be identified. There are cases where Egyptians harmonized Egyptian and Greek elements on the same object, as demonstrated by the tomb stele of Bezas. Although the upper portion of this stele is broken, it still preserves the torsos of 3 figures in high relief. In the center stands the deceased, clad in a Greek himation, flanked by the god Ptah on the left and Osiris on the right. This is thus a monument that combines Egyptian and Greek visual traditions. The inscriptions further illustrate this combination. Each god bears a hieroglyphic captation. On the left, it reads, "May you receive the funerary offerings of the justified," and a similar text likely appeared for Osiris, specifying the offerings of the Ahu, that is, the deceased might receive. This established the sacred communicative space that enacts the reality of eternal funerary offerings for the deceased. This is the sacred sphere, but humans are also addressed, since the stela included a Demotic and a Greek inscription providing information about the deceased. In Demotic, in 2 columns, it is stated, "Long live the soul, it is divine, his car upon his body, united are his bones before Osiris, first of the West, the great Lord, Lord of Abiders, Bezas, son of Theseus, the scribe, who entered the tomb in the 25th year." Below this is a column in Greek, entirely devoid of religious connotations, giving only the essential information and thus reflecting the family's prestige. Bezas, son of Theseus, the hieroglyphic scribe, he lived 25 years. Bezas' father was, as we learn, a master of the ancient art of writing the language of the gods. He arranged for his son to receive an Egyptian burial, yet the son's social elite status was expressed through his Greek attire. At the same time, the Greek inscription highlighted the father's professional prestige, tied explicitly to his Egyptian skill of writing hieroglyphs. The confidence conveyed here reflects the triumph of hieroglyphic writing as some kind magical charged, largely illegible script for the most contemporaries of in Egypt, and as a symbol of the mystery religions associated with Isis and Serapis in Rome. This prestige was recognized even in the imperial capital under certain emperors, as we see in the Roman re-inscription of obelisks such as the Domitian and Antinous obelisks. Perhaps Theseus was one of these sought-after hieroglyphic engravers who even worked for the emperor in Rome. For Greeks, Egyptian funerary culture was by far more attractive than their own rather depressing conception of afterlife, as it offers the deceased a lively and pleasurable afterlife. Many foreigners who came to Egypt adopted local burial practices, as illustrated by the prominent Ptolemaic official, the Dioscorides, who in death became an Egyptian, Osiris Dioscorides. A particularly striking example of posthumous Egyptianization of Greeks is the Ptolemaic tomb stele of Diphilos from Magnesia in Asia Minor. Beneath a lunette featuring a winged sun disk and 2 jackals, one sees a mummy mourned by Isis and Nephthys. The associated Egyptian inscription curiously mixes hieroglyphs and Demotic, with only the donor's ethnic designation Greek rendered in Demotic. It reads, "Diphilos, son of the Greek, born of Artemisia, begotten by the Greek Thearos." In the Greek translation, this becomes Diphilos, son of Thearos, the Magnesian. The crucial information for assessing the status of a Greek in Egypt, his being a Magnesian, does not appear in the Egyptian texts. However, the fact that he was Greek is clearly indicated in Demotic, thus legible to a wider audience. The Greek script, to my knowledge, there's only a single text genre derived from an Egyptian formulary, the so-called proskynemata, votive or devotional graffiti, which appear from the mid-2nd century BC, perhaps only from the early 1st century BC onwards. Because they were typically placed in sacred spaces, such as temple walls, they are commonly referred to as pilgrim inscription. The Greek term proskynema, epigraphically attested exclusively in Egypt, derives from proskyneo. It does not primarily denote prostration, but rather the act of kissing, that is, blowing a kiss, or in Latin, jacere oscula. Essentially, this represents the simplest form of devotion to a deity and reflects a practice familiar in the Greco-Roman world. A person passing a sacred site would raise a hand to the lips and then symbolically cast a kiss towards the god worshipped at that location. Those who have traveled to one of these places sometimes left graffiti as a memory of the journey and simultaneously as a request for divine favor, either for themselves or a family member. Perhaps this was a convenient substitute for dedicating a more expensive object, such as an altar or votive offering. In this way, the inscription ensured that the devotee would remain present before the deity for eternity. The peculiarity of these Greek graffiti in Egypt lies in the use of the term, as said, proskynema. For example, a proskynema from Philae, dated to 89 BCE, reads, Syros, son of Heracleios, scribe. I came, and after I revered the lady, the goddess Isis, I performed the act of devotion for my children. It remains unclear whether this represents a translation of the Demotic word ta veshet, the act of devotion, greeting, which was used in Upper Egypt for similar devotional graffiti, as different formula appear in other regions. Since, however, the earliest Greek proskynemata, and indeed the majority of such graffiti, originate almost exclusively from Upper Egypt, it is plausible that this practice, developed as a translation of the Egyptian ta veshet formula, was occasionally adopted in Greek in other parts of Egypt as well. Religiously, it reflected a practice dating back to early pharaonic times. By inscribing their name at the sacred site, Egyptians hoped their name would endure under the protection of the deity. A demotic proskynema from Aswan illustrates this as follows. May his name endure before Isis, the great, the mighty goddess, Herioi, son of Pachnum. He performed the act of devotion together with his children and Pachnum. What then can be concluded about the epigraphic interaction between Greek and Egyptian writing cultures? First, we have seen that both foreigners and Egyptians produced inscriptions in Greek. Greek was clearly the universal language of Egypt, used by both communities. At the same time, Egyptians continued to employ their sacred hieroglyphic script and the Demotic administrative script. Only under Roman rule did Greek almost entirely displace Demotic. Anyone wishing to communicate in writing was compelled to use Greek. Yet the Egyptian language persisted, re-emerging in the 4th century in the form of Coptic, largely written in Greek letters. Second, Greek is attested across virtually all Egyptian types of monuments. Third, however, although Greek script was used on Egyptian monuments, that does not correspond to the adoption of Egyptian text genre. With the exception of proskynemata, almost no Egyptian text or formula was ever inscribed in Greek. Egyptian temples illustrate this point clearly. All ritual inscriptions remained in Egyptian until the end of the temple religion, as did funerary texts in tombs, on sarcophagi, and on stelae. This means that almost all Greek inscriptions in Egypt, even those composed by Egyptians, follow typical Greek text genres. Fourth, there are very few interactions between the two cultures of writing in terms of text genre. Egyptian texts were almost universally religious in content and remain so. One exception is the priestly decrees, which demonstrate how Egyptian religious concepts led to subtle modifications of a Greek formula. And fifth, there is almost no linguistic interference between Greek and Egyptian epigraphic texts. This is likely because Greek inscriptions, unlike papyri, consists mainly of formulaic phrases that non-native speakers could easily reproduce. By their very nature, formula are conservative in structure. These differences between the two epigraphic traditions led scholars to postulate a cultural gap between Greeks and Egyptians. Yet, this is certainly an overstatement. Egyptians freely used Greek just as the foreigners readily adopted Egyptian religion and culture, even commissioning inscription in hieroglyphs. Furthermore, the majority of Greek inscriptions in Egypt, often composed by Greeks, were religious in content referring to Egyptian or Greco-Egyptian deities. This demonstrates clearly that alongside the universal Greek language, universal Greco-Egyptian gods were invoked. We are thus witnessing a profound cultural appropriation expressed in Greek form. And now, at the end, I want to come back to this curious dedication inscription in philae. Because here at the bottom, we find a later amendation of epigraphy by Benoit Jules Mur, a French scientist who came to Egypt. But some Roman must have time traveled, because beneath this Bemur he wrote stultus est, he is stupid. And with this interference of Greek and French inscriptions and of Latin and French inscription, I would like to end my paper. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for that absolutely wonderful talk. I really, really enjoyed it. And I'm sure I'm not the only one who feels that way. I will let people take a minute to collect their thoughts as to questions that you want to ask. Yeah, like I said before, feel free to either put your questions in the chat, or if you raise your hand, I will be able to call on you. I might start us off with questions. This might be a difficult or tricky question. Oh, someone's asked if we can go to the conclusion slide again. So I think as the person is seeing it, I can ask my question. But yeah, this might be a bit tricky to answer, and I'm sure it's tricky to figure out in the first place. But a lot of these all of these examples, I think, count as public monuments, or at least ones that will be accessible to quite a number of people. Maybe not so much in the case of the funerary stelae. But I was wondering about smaller dedications, let's say things like statues that, maybe, I mean, I see a lot of, late period officials dedicating statues, uh, presumably to Egyptian temples. Um, I was wondering if there are any cases of bilingualism or multilingualism in those and how, if there are cases of, let's say Greek and Greek inscription and a hieroglyphic or demotic inscription, how they interact compared to the more public monuments like the stelae.
So you are asking for statues of Egyptian officials.
Yeah,
Um,
for example,
yeah.
yeah.
We have these statues of Egyptian officials from Tanis or from Thebes or from the Fayoum, and sometimes they have typical autobiographical texts in hieroglyphs, and just the short Greek subscription at the base, who it is. So it's not
Mm,
about it just gives the title. Uh, I think all these exams are collected by Gilles Gore in his book on I've forgotten the name. He has collected all these priests, and sometimes there are short Greek inscriptions which give the
mm,
title and the name, but there is no interaction, I think, between the autobiographical text and the short inscription, because in the short inscription there is, as I remember it right, always given the administrative function and the import. So it's
I
about
see.
prestige. Yeah. But
Fair enough.
one should take a closer look at this. So my answer should be more elaborate if I really take
Mm,
a look at it.
yeah, I mean, that is interesting.
Uh,
I will come back to it if we have time towards the end. I don't want to hog all the questions. Yeah, Justin, if you want to unmute yourself and ask your question, you're free to do that.
Hello. Can everyone hear me and
I,
see me? Okay, good. I'm having a poor internet connection, so I apologize. I just wanted to go back to the Diphilus stela for a moment, which thank you so much for this presentation, by the way. It's very helpful for my work. I work on partially the Diphilus stela before, and I just was always startled by some of Tsautsik's trying to read of the hieroglyphs, which are a little unusual. I just was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about the hieroglyphs that are found on the Diphilus stela and a little bit about their unusualness. Thank you.
ah, I'm really sorry. I, I can read these hieroglyphs, and but I'm not a specialist of to say what is really problematic about them. No? One can, if you can read hieroglyphs, you can put to every sign a consonantal equation, and so um, I would leave the answer to this problem really to a specialist on hieroglyphs and not to me as an ancient historian. I'm very
Sorry.
sorry,
No,
Justin.
it's
I'm
okay.
really
Thank you.
sorry.
I'm also confused. So thank you. I
So
appreciate it.
I can see what is meant, but the real problem, I think, I'm not sophisticated enough to understand it.
It's okay. Thank you so much.
I might ask another question in the meantime, again, while people sort of, yeah, while they gather their thoughts. Um, when it comes to these, the proskynemata and generally graffiti left by foreigners, on Egyptian monuments, um, I work on like the pre-Alexandrian period, and so you can imagine that for me, Abu Simbel really takes up a lot of my time. But I was wondering if you could say anything about the placement of graffiti uh, left by Egyptians and non-Egyptians, and if they differ at all or anything like that.
Are there differences, different practices of Kilroy was here? I, 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 I don't know, but I don't think that there are differences, at least from the Greeks who lived in Egypt, because the Greeks who lived in Egypt really adapted to Egyptian religion and followed the cults of the Egyptians. And so I suppose they did the same like their Egyptian colleagues and followed their examples because they didn't even build their own temples there. This I would suppose. But nobody, to my knowledge, ever has tried to find out if this is really the case or not. So would be a fine PhD, but if the outfind of the PhD would be there is no difference, then it's not very helpful.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I'm assuming, I mean, when it comes to these formally inscribed, let's say the temples, I'm assuming there isn't a difference in where you find the hieroglyphic inscriptions and the Greek inscription, or like there isn't a difference in practice necessarily.
What I find interesting is that graffiti, for example, at Philae, the first pylon of the temple, um, the we have spaces there where at the beginning were no temple reliefs, and the graffiti were placed there so that everybody could see who entered the temple could see them, and they also I think were marked in red so one could read them, and I wouldn't call these even graffiti. Then the temple reliefs were carved out, and I think the graffiti were plastered. And afterwards, again, uh, graffiti were put on the walls by visitors, especially from Meroe. So we have a different layer of writing graffiti on the temples. And even the priests wrote their graffiti on their Greek graffiti on temple reliefs. So they were not always very kind to the reliefs.
Yeah, I think graffiti generally are quite interesting. I mean, in a way, there's such a vivid visualization of the ancient world, and it's. I think it sort of calls to mind so vividly the fact that there was someone there in person, but at the same time, because it's so, or there's such little formality to it. Um,
Yeah,
yeah,
and
I guess.
I think the problem is also the modern term of graffito
Yeah.
because they can they have in antiquity a graffito is something very different from a modern Kilroy was here graffito. So
Hmm.
it was an act of devotion often, right? So
Yeah. Yeah.
nowadays, if you walk through a city and see all these graffiti, there is no act of devotion. These are acts of destruction rather than
Yeah.
devotion. So
Yeah.
the term graffito itself is a little bit misleading,
Hmm.
but we
Yeah,
have
fair enough.
little.
Yeah, I think we have another hand up
Ah,
if you
Gerd,
want to yeah.
nice to
Yes,
see you.
thank you, Stefan, for this talk. Greetings from Leiden, by the way.
Yeah, thank you.
Near the beginning of this talk, you mentioned that the temple in Hermopolis is the only Greek temple from Ptolemaic Egypt. But of course, there's also the remains of the Serapeum in Alexandria.
Ah,
And from there, there's a few expressions of a very short-lived bilingual epigraphic medium phenomenon genre. These foundation plaques, which are of course a very old Egyptian genre, and only in the 3rd century BC we see that in a few temples they also include Greek versions, not translations, but they contain different texts, but clearly in the same tradition, and also alongside these Egyptian flags. And you only see this in the 3rd century. So this is clearly, I would say, maybe a failed genre. What would you say that is the deciding factor maybe in why such a genre like that has failed or has disappeared, while other genres remain popular and thrive? Do you have some thoughts on that?
Yeah, I see a question directly related to your interesting PhD thesis.
Thank you.
Yes, I've left the Serapeum out, and because for me Alexandria is not Egypt, rather it is by Egypt and sometimes in Egypt. But you're completely right. We have these dedication plaques. I have here an example. From the new discovered temple in Alexandria too, the temple to Bastet. And we see that the inscriptions, in contrast to the ones we have seen on these stelae by Parmin, are really translations of each other. They both say in the end the same. And it's a practice to before you build the temple to put these foundation plugs into the fundaments of the temple, which comes from ancient Egyptian ritual. So we clearly have an Egyptian ritual context here. And we have these plaques, not only dedication plaques, not only from Alexandria, but also from Tanis, for example, and from Canopus. So it seems to be widely spread also in Egypt itself. I'm now not quite sure if it really ended in 3rd century. But rather would suppose that it endured, but we don't have any excavations of later temples going down to the fundaments. I have to look it up again, but I think I know a later example from Athribis. But I'm not sure. So eventually, it's a habit that didn't end in the 3rd century, but rather, as everybody knows, absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. Eventually, it lasted, and we don't have any evidence for it because I see no reason why they should have stopped doing this. Or do you? You have done more research in it than I have done. Do you have better idea?
I don't know whether I have any better ideas. I know that this slightly maybe outdated book by Weinstein. It also does not really contain these inscriptions dating to the 2nd century BC or later. And a few years ago, Dorothy Thompson published, I think, a chapter which you should be able to find online also, where she cataloged all known instances of these Greek foundation tablets, also from the ones of the Bubastion in Alexandria. It includes that as well.
It's really a very new paper.
Yeah, and she also stops, or at least she also writes that there's no examples dating to after 200 BC. So also, I believe in Egyptian even. At least that was in Weinstein's book. Yeah. So that's very interesting. The whole genre is apparently polluted in some way. Yeah. No, but that is as much as I know. Thank you for your answer.
Yeah, it's a no answer. I don't know answer.
All right, thank
Sorry
you.
for it. Yeah. But I look it up again. This example from a 3 bits I have in mind. Eventually, it's later.
Can I ask about the this phenomenon of having Greek and Egyptian names? I'm asking out of complete ignorance. I know a little bit about, cases from, the 6th century, 5th century, when we have, some Greeks. I mean, maybe you're familiar with the case of Vahibre Market, uh, whose sarcophagus, I think, is in Leiden. But also you have some Carians who take on Egyptian names,
Mm.
but onomastically are able to figure out that, they have Carian parents or Greek parents and things like that. Um, but in earlier examples, you don't see, explicit double names. You'll see someone who,
Mm.
like in the Abyssal Graffito, you have this, you have the person called Psammetichus, the son of Theocles. And so you know that there's something going on there, but it's
Mm.
hard to figure out whether he's of mixed descent or whether it's a name he took on or something like that. But the idea of having an Egyptian and Greek name is very interesting. So I was just wondering, um, yeah.
It's a quite common practice especially than in Roman Egypt. Um, it's not so easy to change your name, because if you have a Greek name with um, you also have the status of being Greek. And this is on a juridical level something different
Mm,
than just having a second name being so. Uh, but yes, especially the in Roman Egypt, it's quite common to have these double names. I don't know why they did it. Um, but it's also in the wider Greco-Roman world.
mm,
If you look at, for example, at Galatia, where the Celts, the Gallic tribes lived till can be grabbed till the 2nd century AD. They also used the practice of so-called cover names. So a name that sounds Latin, but in reality is Celtic.
fair
Naming
enough.
is a really interesting thing, yeah.
Mm. Yeah, it's interesting because, obviously it makes me want to ask questions that we probably almost definitely can't answer. Like,
Yeah.
when did someone go by one name as opposed to the other? And, do they acquire these names at birth? I mean, the idea of someone being given a completely foreign name, as someone who's grown up in India with the diversity of communities,
Yeah.
um, it's not impossible. It's not unfamiliar that you're growing up next to someone from the south of India who's called George,
Mm.
um, whereas my name, of course, is very Indian. But at the same time, it just obviously, these kinds of comparisons are difficult to substantiate without having some kind of basis. Um, but it's very interesting anyways.
Yes, but when, for example, someone in India gives the name George to his kid, may that be also a religious name, as George is a very Christian name?
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
For example, in Egypt, Girgis is, he's a Copt. So,
Hmm. Yeah, no, I mean, exactly. Like, there's that kind of element in there. And so it makes me wonder, again, I think there's a little bit of a gap between connecting the sort of like the Saite and Persian, well, Saite more than Persian period to the Ptolemaic period.
mm,
And I'm trying to sort of like move between the two with these questions.
mm,
Uh, but I mean, it does make me wonder, of cases where you'll have a Greek who's settled in Egypt who is potentially taking on a Basilophorus name, which
mm.
is not unfamiliar amongst, officials in Saite Egypt, for
Yeah,
example.
yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. But yeah, it makes me wonder where, I mean, it makes me wonder where I, see an Egyptian name and whether the person, and that he's Greek or his parents are Greek, and whether he actually had a Greek name
Mm.
secretly, which he doesn't use in, the public Egyptian context.
Yeah. Justin just said Papio Apollonius Peti Harempi for interesting papyrological evidences. And while quoting Apollonius, I just would like again to refer to where do we have it? The other Apollonius I have just shown. Where is he, my Apollonius? The one who had two tomb stelae, one typical Egyptian and one as Apollonius, typical Greek.
Hmm.
So this one, if we only would have the left stele, we would think he is a Greek with a
Yep.
with an epigram on it. If we only would have the right one, we would clearly say he's an Egyptian. So what? So all these questions about identity are stupid in Egypt.
Yeah, fair enough.
I refrain from using the concept of identity in Egypt, so it's not working.
Hmm, fair enough. Um, I think if nobody has any last questions, I will ask. I hope that that noise isn't audible. But I will ask a final question, maybe of my own. Uh, Maybe you mentioned this briefly, but I was just wondering, when we're looking at inscriptions in different languages on the same medium or on the same object or in the same setting, uh, who are we imagining writing the inscriptions? Are we assuming that, let's say the Egyptian priests composing the synodal decrees, that they do know Greek? You were saying, like we get a sense of how they deal with Greek because, like Greek
Mm.
epigraphy is quite formulaic. So, yeah.
There is one scholar in the whole world who is somehow the most important person working on such things. That is Willi Clarisse from Leuven University, and he also, as to be expected, he also studied the synodal decrees, and I think he's
Mm,
quite right. He thinks that the priests could write all the three texts. So they were specialists. They were the intermediaries between population and the ruler. They knew their Greek. They wrote the contracts in Greek, so there was
mhm.
no problem for them to write the Greek texts. And they surely wrote the hieroglyphic texts, and they had
Yeah.
discussions in Demotic, I think. Yeah. So
Is there any role that maybe interpreters play to the extent that we can find them or
yeah,
yeah.
there are not many references to interpreters. I know only of Herodotus. um,
Uh, I think I I will send you the reference later. I think there's a case of someone who has a Carian name and potentially is Carian who calls himself an interpreter. Um, and it's related to Carians in Egypt, but I'm not an expert on this at all. But yeah.
And you can also ask Maren, who had worked about the Demotic or Greek translations of contracts.
Hmm. Yeah,
She
yeah, of course. Yeah.
she's a specialist for this.
I know what to bring up in my next meeting then.
Yeah.
Um, if we don't have any more questions, I will thank Stefan again for an absolutely wonderful paper. And thank you to the people who participated in this discussion. This is exactly what the series is meant to do. I think we are aiming for people to ask the questions that can't necessarily be answered as satisfyingly as we'd want them to be, but I think this was a great example of the process working. I learned a lot. So yeah, thank you again. This was
And
really, really nice.
thank you, Justin, and thank you, Gert.